Our channel recently came across a very powerful story that truly made us stop and reflect. What you're about to hear is a real story that invites us to think deeply about faith, family, and the decisions we make throughout our lives. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next stories and reflections like this one. Now, let's get into the story.
My name is Harold Eugene Whitfield, and I am 83 years old. I have lived most of those years believing I was doing the right thing. I have kept the Sabbath from sundown, Friday to sundown Saturday, for as long as I can remember. Without exception, without negotiation, without apology, I have abstained from pork, from shellfish, from caffeine. I have tithed faithfully, attended prayer meeting every Wednesday night, and served as an elder in the Maranatha Seventh-day Adventist Church of Harlan, Kentucky, for nearly 4 decades. I believed, truly believed, that this obedience was the highest form of love I could offer. To God, to my family, to the world. But now I sit in this narrow bed in the Shady Creek Senior Living Center on the east side of Harlan, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looks like a map of nowhere, and I wonder if I got the whole thing wrong. Not the faith. I still believe in God. I still believe in the Sabbath and in the writings of Ellen White and in the Great Controversy and in the Second Coming. No, I have not lost my theology. What I have lost is my children, and I am beginning to understand only now, here at the end of my life, that those two losses might be connected. My friend Arthur Clemens, the man in the room next to mine, a retired Baptist minister from Barberville with a laugh like a church bell and the patience of a saint, he is the one who told me I needed to write it all down, or at least talk about it. He said keeping a wound sealed doesn't heal it. He said light is what cleans a wound. So here I am, Harold Eugene Whitfield, trying to let in some light. I come from Adventist stock 3 generations deep. My grandfather, Ezra Whitfield, was baptized into the Adventist faith in 1901, when the movement was still young and fierce and full of fire. He had been a Methodist before that. But when a traveling Adventist evangelist came through Harlan County and pitched a tent on the edge of the Clover Fork River, my grandfather sat in that tent for 11 nights straight and came out a changed man. He gave up his tobacco, his Sunday worship, and eventually his first wife, who refused to follow him into what she called that strange new religion. My father, Clement Whitfield, was raised in that faith the way some boys are raised in a trade. It was simply what you were. You did not question it. You did not explore alternatives. You woke up on Saturday morning, you put on your good clothes, you went to church, and you were grateful. My father was a quiet man, but a hard one. Not cruel, not violent, but rigid in the way that old oak trees are rigid. There was no flex in him, no give. When the Sabbath came, everything else stopped. The garden stopped, the homework stopped, the radio stopped, even laughter stopped, or at least it was muted into something more appropriate, something reverent. God's time was God's time, and you did not spend it on yourself. I loved my father. I still do. But I can see now, from this distance, that what he passed on to me was not just a faith. It was a method, a system, a set of rules that he held up like armor and taught me to hold up the same way. Not because the rules were wrong, many of them weren't, but because he had never been taught to separate the rules from the relationship. He had never been shown that you could love God tenderly, the way you love a father, rather than fearfully, the way you fear a judge. So I inherited his method, and I passed it on in turn, the way you pass on an old piece of furniture that's been in the family so long you never think to ask whether it's actually comfortable. I met Margaret Ann Blevins at a church camp meeting in Corbin in the summer of 1965. She was 20 years old and wearing a yellow dress and singing "Leaning on the Everlasting Arms," with her eyes closed and her face tilted up like she was receiving something from the sky. I was 22, and I had never in my life seen anyone look that happy in church. Most people I knew in church looked dutiful. Margaret looked joyful, and that was something different entirely. We courted for a year, married in the spring of 1966, and moved into a small house on Cumberland Avenue in Harlan. I worked at the hardware store my uncle owned. Margaret taught second grade at the elementary school 2 blocks from the church. She was warm where I was stiff. She was soft where I was hard. She had a way of putting her hand on a person's arm when she talked to them that made them feel like the most important person in the room. I loved her with everything I had, though I realize now that I did not always show her that love in ways she could receive. Our children came in 3 parts. Daniel Clement Whitfield was born in 1968, serious and watchful from the very beginning, a child who observed the world before entering it. James Robert Whitfield came 2 years later, louder and brighter, the kind of boy who filled whatever room he was in. And then, after a long gap and what Margaret privately called a beautiful surprise, Ruth Elaine Whitfield was born in 1982, 14 years after Daniel, and she was the light of Margaret's life and mine. Ruth had her mother's eyes and, as it turned out, her mother's heart, soft, attentive, capable of a kind of patience I had never managed to cultivate. I want to be honest about what life was like in our home, because I think honesty is what Arthur says I need right now, and I think he's right. Our home was ordered, it was clean, it was Adventist in every corner and on every wall. We had the framed 10 Commandments in the hallway. We had the Desire of Ages on the living room shelf beside the Bible. We had a family worship every morning at 6:30, before school, before work, before anything else. I read from the Bible, we prayed, we sang a hymn. This was not optional. On Sabbath, the preparation began Friday afternoon. Margaret cooked the meals for the whole weekend so that no cooking would happen on the holy day. The television was unplugged. The boys were not permitted to ride their bikes or play baseball with the neighborhood children. We went to church, we came home, we rested, we read. I believed this was right. I believed this was what God required, and that my duty as the head of the household was to ensure that my family honored it, whether they wanted to or not, and they often did not want to. I remember Daniel, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, watching through the living room window as the neighborhood boys played a pickup game of baseball in the empty lot across the street. He watched for a long time without saying anything. Then he turned to me and asked if he could just go watch, not play, just watch. I told him no. I told him the Sabbath was not a time for watching the world pursue its pleasures. He nodded and went to his room, and I did not think about it again for many years. I think about it now almost every day. James was more vocal in his frustrations, which led to more conflict between us. He was the kind of boy who pushed back, who asked why, who wanted a reason before he complied. I did not have much patience for that. My father had not given me reasons. He had given me instructions, and I had followed them, and I expected the same from my sons. James and I fought regularly, and I mean fought in the verbal sense, loudly and with damage. Margaret would go quiet in those moments, and I know now that her silence was not approval. It was grief. She was grieving something she saw happening that she did not know how to stop, and I was too convinced of my own righteousness to see it. Ruth was too young during those years to fight me much. She was a small, watchful girl who seemed to understand by instinct that the best way to navigate a rigid thing was to move around it rather than against it. She went along. She sang in Sabbath school. She memorized her Bible verses. She was the model Adventist child, and I was proud of her, and I did not ask often enough whether she was happy. Boys become teenagers, and teenagers become men, and men must make their own choices. That is the way of things. I knew it in principle, but I was not prepared for it in practice. Daniel left for college at 18. He had won a scholarship to study engineering at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, and within 2 semesters he had stopped attending the Adventist church near campus. When he came home for summers, he slept in on Sabbath. The first time it happened, I went to his room and woke him and told him to get dressed. He sat up in bed and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not defiance, just a kind of tired resignation, as if he had been waiting for this moment his whole life, and was mildly relieved it had finally arrived. He said, "Dad, I'm not going." And I said, "As long as you are under my roof, you will honor God's law." And he said quietly, "That's fine. I'll find somewhere else to be." He stayed in his room that Sabbath and I sat in church, unable to hear a single word of the sermon. James went a different route. He never left the church formally or dramatically. He simply faded. He married a woman who was not Adventist, a kind, good-hearted Methodist woman named Brenda from Middlesbrough, and they built a life that included Sunday services when they attended church at all, which became less and less frequent over the years. I made my disapproval clear on more than one occasion. I told James that he had married outside the faith, and that this was a spiritual mistake, and that I prayed he would find his way back to the truth. James listened to this each time with a patience that I now recognize as hard-won grace. And then he began visiting less, and then he stopped visiting at all. I told myself they had made their choices. I told myself that I had done my part, that I had raised them in the way they should go, and if they departed from it, that was between them and God. I told myself this many times, and I mostly believed it, and I continued my life in the church, in the elders' chair, in the Wednesday night prayer meetings, in the Sabbath services, in the community that had been my whole world since birth. Margaret said less and less about the children as the years passed. She kept in touch with both boys by phone, quietly, without making a production of it. She drove to Lexington once to have lunch with Daniel and his wife, a woman from Ohio named Sarah, who was not religious at all. She never told me how that visit went. I never asked. I think I was afraid of the answer. I think some part of me knew that Margaret had built a separate relationship with our sons, one that existed outside my reach and outside my rules, because my rules had made the primary relationship impossible. Ruth, in those years, was still home. She was our teenager, our youngest, and she moved through the house like a question I had never learned how to answer. She attended church faithfully, but I could see something shifting in her, some slow withdrawal of the wholehearted participation she had given as a child. She did not argue with me the way James had. She did not build walls the way Daniel had. She simply became quieter, more private, more careful with what she shared. She had friends I did not know. She had a life I was not invited into. I told myself this was normal for teenagers. I told myself she was still in the pew every Sabbath, and that was what mattered. Margaret was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the autumn of 1997. She was 52 years old. She had been having some discomfort for months that she had mentioned to me once, and I had told her to see the doctor, and she had put it off the way busy women put things off, taking care of everyone else first, and by the time the doctors got a look at it, the cancer had already spread beyond the ovary. Those 2 years of her illness were the most frightening of my life. I prayed more during that time than I had ever prayed before. I fasted. I asked the elders to anoint her. I truly believed, that God would heal her, that her faith would be vindicated, that she would recover and stand as a testimony to the power of prayer. The church rallied around us beautifully. There were meals on the doorstep every night for months. There were prayer circles and anointing services and letters from churches across the conference. The community of faith showed up in every way that mattered. Daniel came home when his mother got sick. He and Sarah drove down from Lexington on weekends whenever they could. James came from Middlesbrough more often, and he and Brenda helped with the practical things, the groceries, the lawn, the medical appointments when I could not get away from work. Ruth was still at home, and she bore the heaviest share, the daily weight of it, the changed sheets and the medications, and the long, quiet evenings sitting at her mother's bedside, holding her hand. I am grateful for all of it. But I want to be honest about something that shames me even now. During those 2 years of Margaret's illness, even as my sons came home and my daughter held the household together, I was still more concerned with maintaining the order of our spiritual life than with simply being present. I still insisted on Sabbath observance in that house. I still led worship in the mornings, even when Margaret was too tired to sit up. I still expected everyone under that roof to operate by the rules. And I could see it in my sons' faces that they were there for their mother, not for me. That they had come home to love her, and that loving me was a different and more complicated project they had not yet sorted out. Margaret died on a Thursday morning in March of 1999. She was 54 years old. The yellow dress she had worn at that camp meeting in Corbin was long gone, but her face at the end had the same quality it had had in that tent, the same upward tilt of someone receiving something from above. I held her hand when she went. Ruth was on the other side of the bed. Daniel and James were in the hallway because the room was small, and we had not planned for the moment to come so quickly. She was gone, and with her went the thread that had held my family to me. I do not entirely understand what happened after Margaret died. I understand it better now after talking to Arthur, but at the time it simply felt like abandonment, like punishment. My sons came for the funeral, stayed a week, and then returned to their lives. Their visits after that were rare, and when they came there was a formality to them, a careful politeness that was more painful than anger would have been. They were not cruel to me, they were distant, and distance, I learned, can be its own cruelty. Ruth called more often. She had taken an apartment in Lexington after finishing at the community college in Harlan, and she was working at a pediatric clinic as a medical assistant. She called on Sunday evenings usually, and we talked for 20 or 30 minutes about surface things, her work, the weather, my garden, the church news. She asked about my health. I asked about her life. We were careful with each other. But she called. She was the one who called. I told myself that Daniel and James were busy, that they had their families, their careers, their lives, that this was normal, that grown children moved away and built their own worlds, and you could not expect them to orbit you forever. I told myself that I had done my duty, that I had raised them in the faith, that what they chose to do with that was not my responsibility. I told myself all of this with great consistency and considerable conviction. And if Margaret had been there, she would have seen through every word of it. But Margaret was not there. The church remained. The church was constant. I still had my elder's role, my prayer meeting, my Sabbath services. I still had the community, the potlucks after church, the mission offerings, the Pathfinder Club I had helped run for years. I poured everything I had into the church, and the church received it all with gratitude and affirmation. And I lived inside that affirmation because outside of it there was a silence I could not bear to enter. The years passed, 10 of them, 20. Daniel called at Christmas and on my birthday. James sent cards, sometimes with a brief note, sometimes just his signature. Ruth called on Sundays. I was not unhappy exactly. I was in my church. I was in my faith. But the house on Cumberland Avenue grew very large and very quiet, and some evenings the silence in it had a weight to it that pressed down on my chest and made it hard to breathe. I sold the house in 2015 and moved into a smaller apartment near the church. My knees had been bad for years, and the stairs in the old house were becoming a problem. I continued attending services until 2019, when a series of small strokes made driving unsafe, and my doctor told me in plain terms that I needed to be somewhere with care available. I moved into the Shady Creek Senior Living Center that autumn, and that is where I have been ever since, and that is where I met Arthur Clemens. Arthur Clemens is 80 years old and has been a widower for 6 years. He spent 40 years as a Baptist minister in Barbourville before retiring, and he has one of the finest minds I have ever encountered. He reads theology in the mornings, novels in the afternoons, and plays chess with the evening staff whenever he can convince them to sit down. He lost a son to a drug overdose in the 1990s, a grief so enormous I can barely imagine carrying it. And that loss gave him a particular quality of mercy that I have not encountered often in religious men. He does not judge quickly. He listens before he speaks, and when he speaks, he means what he says. We became friends the way old men become friends, slowly and practically, over shared meals and long afternoons with nowhere particular to be. Arthur is Baptist, and I am Adventist, and we have had many spirited and occasionally heated discussions about theology, which we both enjoy enormously, and which neither of us takes personally. But he is not the kind of man who uses theological difference as a reason to close a door. He is the kind of man who holds doors open. I told him about Margaret one afternoon in the common room. It started simply enough. He had asked about the photograph I keep on my windowsill, the one of Margaret in the yellow dress at the camp meeting. I told him when and where it was taken. I told him we had been married 33 years when she died. He asked about the children, and then, I'm not sure exactly how, I told him everything. I told him about my grandfather and my father and the inheritance of rigid faith. I told him about the baseball game Daniel had watched through the window. I told him about the fights with James and the silent walls Daniel had built and the careful phone calls from Ruth on Sunday evenings. I told him about Margaret's illness and the way my sons had come home for her and not for me, and how I had known it even then and not let myself feel it. I told him about the years of silence and the growing weight of the house after she died, and the apartment and the strokes and the nursing home, and here, this narrow bed, this water stain on the ceiling. I talked for a very long time. Arthur listened to all of it. When I finished, he was quiet for a while, looking out the window at the parking lot, which is not a beautiful view, but he seemed to be seeing something beyond it. Then he said, "Harold, can I ask you something honest?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Did you love your children?" And I said, "Of course I did, with my whole heart." He nodded. He said, "I believe you." And then he said, "Did they know that?" And I was quiet for a long time, and when I answered, I said, "I believed they knew." And he said gently, but without softening it very much, "What do you think they experienced?" I did not answer that for several days. I thought about it alone in my room. I thought about Daniel watching through the window. I thought about James's face the last time I had told him his marriage was a spiritual mistake. I thought about Ruth's careful phone calls and her careful words and the things she did not say. And I understood, finally, with a clarity that was almost physical in its pain, that what my children had experienced was not primarily my love. What they had experienced was my doctrine, my system, my inflexible, uncompromising, all-consuming adherence to a set of practices that I had placed so firmly at the center of my family life that there was not always room for them in it. I had loved them, but I had loved my faith more visibly. And children, pay attention to what you love most visibly. It was Arthur who suggested the letter. He said, "Harold, you have children out there who may not know that you see what you see now." He said, "You don't have to be at the end of your life without trying to close this." He said, "Write them a letter, not a sermon, not a defense, just a father talking to his children." I told him it had been more than 30 years since I had spoken to Daniel and James with anything approaching real closeness. More than 30 years. Ruth still called, but even with Ruth there was this layer of careful distance between us, like a window I could see through but not open. Arthur said, 30 years is not the point. The point is whether you still have time. And you do. So use it. I wrote the letter over 3 days. I threw away the first 4 attempts. The first one was too much like a sermon, full of scriptural references and theological explanations, exactly the thing Arthur told me to avoid. The second was too defensive, a long accounting of why I had done what I had done, which is not the same as an apology. The third was too brief, too scared. The fourth was too sentimental, too performative, more about making myself feel better than about truly reaching them. The fifth one was the right one, or at least it was the truest one I knew how to write. I addressed it to all three of my children at the addresses I'd last known for them, which were old, and I asked the staff to help me find more current ones, which they did after some effort. I told my children that I had been thinking about our lives together, and that I had come to understand something I had not been able to see clearly when we were all in it together. I told them that I had raised them with a faith that was real to me, and that the faith itself I did not regret, but that I had allowed the structure of that faith to become a wall rather than a door, and that I was sorry for the distance that wall had created. I told Daniel that I remembered the baseball game, and that I wished I had let him go watch. I told James that his marriage had been a gift, that Brenda was clearly a good woman, and that I had been wrong to say otherwise and to keep saying it. I told Ruth that I knew she had been the one who kept trying, who kept calling, who kept the line open, and that I was grateful for it and had not said so nearly enough. I told all three of them that I loved them, that I had always loved them, that I was sorry the love had not always reached them in a form they could receive. I mailed the letter in the spring, 3 separate envelopes, the same letter in each one, with a brief handwritten note at the top, personalizing it for each child. Then I waited. From Daniel, I heard nothing. The envelope was not returned, so it reached him, or at least an address he had been associated with. But there was no call, no letter in reply, no message relayed through Ruth. Nothing. I do not know if he read it. I do not know if he opened it. I have made peace with not knowing, or I am trying to. From James, I also heard nothing. Ruth told me later, much later, that James had received the letter and had set it on his kitchen counter and had not been able to bring himself to open it, that the envelope had sat there for weeks, that Brenda had told him several times that he should at least read it, and that he had said he needed more time. Ruth did not tell me whether he ever found that time. From Ruth, I heard nothing for several months, and I began to think that perhaps the letter had been lost, or gone to an old address, or that she too had received it and could not find words to respond. And then one Sunday evening in the autumn, the phone in my room rang, and it was her. She said, "Dad, I got your letter." She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her breathing. She said, "I just needed some time with it." I said I understood. She said, "I've been thinking about calling for weeks, and I didn't know what to say." I said, "You don't have to say anything, sweetheart. I just wanted you to know." We talked for 2 hours that night, the longest conversation we had had in decades. She told me things she had never told me, about what it had been like to grow up in our house, the way she had loved the faith but feared the environment, the way she had missed her brothers after they left, the way she had held herself a little apart from the world her whole adult life, because the template she had been given for community was one built on compliance rather than belonging. She said these things without cruelty and without anger. She said them the way her mother used to say hard things, with gentleness and precision, and I listened. I did not defend. I did not explain. I did not offer scripture. I simply listened to my daughter tell me who she was and what her life had been, and it was one of the most painful and most precious hours of my existence. Before she hung up, she said she was going to try to get her brothers together to come visit me. She said she thought it was time. She said she wasn't going to promise because she didn't know how Daniel and James would respond, but she was going to try. I told her I would be here. I said, "I'm not going anywhere." And we both laughed, a little sadly, because of course that was true in every sense. I was 83 years old in a nursing home. I was not going anywhere. She said she would call again soon. She said she loved me. It was the first time in a long time that those words had moved through the phone without any careful distance around them. Just the words, plain and direct, the way love is supposed to travel. Ruth was slower to get the letter than her brothers. She had moved to a new apartment in Louisville in the spring, a new job at a larger medical practice, and the letter had gone to her old address in Lexington and had sat in a forwarding pile at the post office for months before reaching her. By the time she called me, I had been in the letter's silence for nearly 6 months. She worked on Daniel and James through the winter. She called them, she texted them, she sent emails. She told me about these efforts in our Sunday calls, which had resumed with a new quality, a new openness that made me feel for the first time in many years like I was talking to my daughter rather than to a careful version of her. She said Daniel was softening. She said James was harder, that the hurt in him was older and had more time to set. But she kept trying. By February, she had extracted a commitment from both of them to drive to Harlan in March and visit me at Shady Creek. She called me on a Wednesday evening to tell me they were coming. She said all 3 of us, Dad, the last weekend in March. She said, "Start thinking about what you want to say because I think we all have some talking to do." I put the phone down and sat in the chair by my window and looked at the photograph of Margaret in the yellow dress, and I said to her, as I sometimes do, "We're going to be okay. I think we might finally be okay." 3 days later, I had a heart attack in my sleep, a massive one. I did not wake up from it. The nurses found me in the morning, peaceful, they said, no sign of distress. The Lord took me quietly, which is perhaps more than I deserved and exactly what Margaret would have prayed for. I did not get to see my children's faces when they walked through the door of Shady Creek that last weekend of March. I did not get to sit with Daniel and find out who he had become. I did not get to tell James in person that I was proud of him, that his life had been well lived, that Brenda was a treasure. I did not get to hold Ruth's hand across a table and look into her eyes that looked like her mother's eyes and tell her that she was the best of me, the most faithful of me, the one who kept the door open when I'd given her every reason to close it. I did not get those things. The time ran out before the courage bore fruit. And that is a grief that belongs to the story now, unchangeable, complete. What I can tell you, what I believe, from wherever it is I am now, is that Ruth read the letter, that she heard her father's voice in it, maybe for the first time clearly, that she made the phone call, and we had the 2 hours, and the love moved through the wire without all the careful distance around it, that she tried, right up to the end, to bring her family back together. That the trying was worth something even when the time ran short, and I can tell you about Arthur. Arthur, who listened to an old Adventist man tell his whole sad story in a common room with a bad view of a parking lot, and who asked the right questions and said the right things and suggested the letter. Arthur, who sat with me through those winter months of waiting. Arthur, who prayed for me and with me, Baptist prayers full of a warmth and directness I had not known my whole Adventist life, and who showed me, without ever saying it directly, that the point of faith was always the people and never the system. I hope Daniel opens the letter someday. I hope James reads it. I hope that knowing their father saw his own failure clearly, even late, even too late to sit across from them and say it, gives them something. Not everything, but something. And I hope this story finds the people who need it before the time runs out for them. If you are reading this, and you are a faithful Adventist, someone who loves the Sabbath, who loves the health message, who loves the prophetic understanding and the community and the hymns and the heritage, then please hear what Harold Whitfield is trying to say from the other side of his own story. The faith is not the problem. Let no one read this and conclude that faith is the enemy of family, that religion is the cause of distance, that doctrine destroys love. That is not what happened here. What happened here is that a man confused the container with the contents. He held the vessel of his faith with such rigid hands that he could not also hold his children. He polished the lamp so diligently that he forgot to tend the flame. The Sabbath is a gift, but it was given for man, not man for it. The health message is wisdom, But wisdom applied without mercy becomes merely another form of pride. The doctrines are precious, but doctrine memorized without love is a bell without a clapper. It makes a shape, but no music. Your children are watching what you love most visibly. Your children are learning right now whether the faith in your house is a place of belonging or a place of performance. They are learning whether God in your home is a father who delights in them or a judge who measures them. They will carry what they learn in your home for the rest of their lives, and eventually they will make decisions about their own relationship with God based in large part on what they witnessed in yours. So tend the flame. Keep the Sabbath, yes. Keep it with joy and with rest and with beauty. Open your table and your arms and your Sabbath hours to your children, and let them feel in the warmth of that day that they are the reason for it. Let the structure serve the relationship. Let the doctrine be the road, not the destination. And if you have already been Harold Whitfield, if the years have passed and the children have grown distant and the house is quiet and the damage is done, then write the letter. Pick up the phone. Drive to wherever they are. Say the words. Say them plainly, without defense, without explanation, without scripture as a shield. Just say, I love you. I am sorry. You mattered more than I showed. Say it now. Do not wait for the last weekend of March. Time is the one thing faith cannot replenish. In memory of every father and mother who loved God and their children and is still learning how to love them both at the same time.